You've probably heard this question asked sometime this year: where's the rigor? Maybe it was a question that was asked of you by a school administrator. Maybe it was a question that you were discussing during your common planning time. But that's an important question that has been asked, and it's also a question that's hard to answer. What do we really mean by rigor? And so this webinar is going to help us create a definition of rigor, and also to be able to determine what we need to, how we would know that it's present or that it's there. And so that is the goal of this presentation. One way to begin is to just start with, what is our current understanding? How do we define rigor? And so taking a few minutes to turn and talk to the person next to you and just share with them your picture, your drawing, and then also your 1 to 2 sentence definition of what is rigor. So go ahead and do that now. One of the things to begin with is that there isn't really a clear definition of rigor. You can ask, you can read, different people have different ways of defining it. But what we might want to think about when we're starting to describe rigor is, what does it include? What does it have to have? How can we know that a classroom has rigor? What would we be looking for? And so one way to begin is to just think of it in a very general description, which is academic rigor is determined not just by what is taught, but how it is taught and how it is assessed. And that's from Barbara Blackburn, University of North Carolina. So one of the things to start out with is to start to look at rigor in terms of different components or pieces, and together those make up our understanding of what does it mean to have, what is rigor, or where is the rigor. So content is really important. When we talk about content, we're referring to standards. What are the knowledge, skills, and abilities that students are expected to learn and do? We're also talking about pedagogy. How does a teacher, what are the teaching practices? What are the instructional practices that make up classroom learning? And we're also including assessments, thinking about the local assessments. What types of ways do teachers measure or to determine end products of student learning in their own classrooms, as well as the state assessments that are usually summative and occur sometime near the end of the year, that are also measuring that understanding. And so in order to really get at the heart of rigor, we really need to look at those 3 pieces. What is the content, the pedagogy, as well as the assessment? So just beginning with the content, the implementation or the adoption of the Common Core State Standards in New Mexico was one way to bring a rigorous curriculum to all students. And so when you think about the Common Core State Standards, one way to define it, or one way that makes it rigorous, is that it is focused, it is coherent, and it is appropriately challenging. This is just the sample page of the Anchor Standards for Reading, and you'll see that these are extremely focused standards. There's 10. They are coherent. They're covering different aspects of reading comprehension, being able to not only pick out the key details, which is important, but to go a little bit deeper and to understand the structure of narrative text and the craft, how authors particularly shape language, and then also including this integration, being able to draw conclusions, to use information from more than one text, to be able to have a deeper, richer understanding. And so in many ways, the adoption of the Common Core State Standards these standards are rigorous. And the implementation of them is one way in which we can ensure that students have access to a rigorous curriculum. But it doesn't end there. Just because the standards are adopted doesn't mean that we have rigorous classrooms. It's the implementation, it's the decision making on the teacher that really is another part of ensuring that students have access to rigorous lessons. So what happens in a classroom is an extremely important way to determine if rigor is there. And so some of the questions that you can ask is, when you're looking at a classroom or even self-reflecting on your own, what kinds of questions is the teacher asking? Are all students engaged in thinking? Are students given time to think through answers? Are students talking and sharing information appropriately? What you may find when you look at these types of questions is how much they are similar to or align with the New Mexico Teach rubric and those effective and highly effective teaching practices. And one of the things that you'll see is that rigorous classrooms tend to have effective or highly effective teaching practices as they are defined in that New Mexico Teaching rubric. And so in many ways, having the access to the New Mexico Teach rubric and that feedback that you were given by your principal this year really does help to determine if there is going to be rigor in that classroom, thinking about how those standards are implemented. So here's just some images around what types of things you would want to see in this rigorous classroom. Conversation, discussion about concepts, and then that full engagement in work that is standards-based. Neuroscience has done a lot of research around what is the brain doing when there's rigorous learning. These are just two really clear statements that help us to understand why we want to encourage more of this in our classroom practices. Assignments that are demanding give the brain a workout that has lasting positive effects. If you think of the brain as a learning machine, then the more you push it to learn, then the more powerful it becomes. So if we went inside the brain and we thought about, or we studied it, or we analyzed what's happening when a student is given rigorous assignments or rigorous learning, there's something really interesting to take away. Brain activity, whether you're giving a student something that's asking them to write a critical essay, or you're giving them a fill-in-the-blank response, the brain acts the same. What you will see is you will see a lot of interaction of neurons and a lot of firing off of information. But what is different in rigorous learning is what part of the brain is activated. Rigorous learning tends to include or often require the representation of information in complicated or complex ways, thinking creatively to being able to find rich connections between different types of information, and usually generating an answer that is not quite clear. There's not only one answer. So what happens when students are asked to do this type of learning is the part of the brain, the frontal region of the brain, is activated, and researchers see a lot of activity in this area of the brain. And so what's interesting about that is that when you have a lot of activity in this frontal lobe, you're not only strengthening it. Remember that previous idea was that the more you use it, the better it becomes. But it also helps create these really rich patterns that are memorable for the brain. And so when students are engaged in learning that requires the activation of the frontal lobe, they are better able to recall those learning experiences and also to draw connections or to see analogies between things that they have learned. And so in some ways the learning becomes richer. The final piece that we're moving into is the rigorous assessments, and that is for many of us, it's the PARCC assessment. And one of the ways in which the PARCC assessment is rigorous is that it's designed to show what students learn or can do. And so PARCC is an evidence-based design assessment, which means that it is an assessment that is designed purposefully so that you can see evidence of learning in student responses and in student works. You're being able to look at the work and see what students are able to do and what they're not able to do. Um, and that's a little bit different than a multiple choice test, which is looking for the right answer. Here, what you're able to see is the range of learning, and that's just how this assessment is designed. So now we're going to take a little bit of a closer look into the third grade sample item and really hone in on what makes it rigorous. But we're going to need a tool to do that. And so we're going to be analyzing or looking closely at the third grade sample. The text is called Me First by Helen Lessiter. So two tools that can help in determining rigor on an assessment is Bloom's taxonomy and Webb's depth of knowledge. These are probably tools that you're very familiar with. Bloom's taxonomy really is a way in which you can determine or categorize the level of thinking or the level of brain activity that you are asking students to do. So you might ask them to use to remember something, which would be asking their brain to recall, or you might ask a student to evaluate something, which is to make some kind of judgment or critique. And so that's what Bloom's taxonomy is able to determine, just the level of thinking or the level of brain activity. Webb's depth of knowledge is a little bit different, and what that is helping us to determine or answers the question is, how deeply do you need to understand the content to be successful? So it's tied to the understanding of content. And then what kind of mental processing do I need to engage in to be able to show my understanding of the content? And so these two tools we are going to be applying to the questions on the PARCC assessment to really get at or to help open up and show you what exactly makes these questions rigorous in terms of the level of thinking that the brain is going to need to do, as well as the deep understanding of the content that the student will need to be successful. So we're going to be pairing those two together. What we will be using will be the Hess Cognitive Rigor Matrix, and you will have a copy of this. And so this is one way in which those two tools are put together on one sheet of paper to help make those understanding clear about what makes a question or problem rigorous. So we're going to be looking at the PARCC sample assessment. We're looking at the grade 3 story called Me First by Helen Lessiter, and then we're going to be looking at a couple questions and just analyzing, digging a little deeper into them to really understand what makes them rigorous using Bloom's taxonomy as well as Webb's depth of knowledge. So if you have not had a chance to read Me First by Helen Lessiter, I can quickly summarize it to say it is a story about a pig named Pinkerton who's pink, plump, and pushy. And he basically wants to be first all the time, shouts me first, and he continues to have this behavior. Sometime in the middle of the story, he's at the beach and it's his need to be first. He meets a witch, and this witch teaches him an important lesson about being first. And when the story ends, Pinkerton is a changed pig. He returns to the bus very, very different. And so he's kind of learned his lesson about being first. And so when we look at the questions that have to deal with the text, I'm going to just kind of think out loud about what would be the required thinking that a student would have to have in order to be able to answer this question. That's going to help us to get to the understanding what makes these questions rigorous. So part A, first question. What does the phrase, his teeth jiggled in paragraph 14 show about Pinkerton? And then all the answers. Pinkerton feels pain, tired, excited, nervous. And so I know already and looking at this question that it's not a remember question. It's not just what do I remember the word jiggled means. It's not even that jiggled was stated in the text. It's really moving on Bloom's taxonomy, something that I have to understand. I have to construct the meaning of it, and I have to look at paragraph 14. So when I go to paragraph 14, that's going to help me. So I have to show my understanding of jiggled in this paragraph, but I also have to show it in connection to Pinkerton. And that's where the depth of knowledge comes in, or Webb comes in, because the content that they're asking for here is not just the understanding of the word jiggled, but the understanding of the phrase jiggled as it relates to Pinkerton and his character. And so that's a little bit more challenging. And so when you look at this question here, you have an understand question on Bloom's taxonomy, but the level, the DOK, it's a recall information by being able to select the appropriate words when intended meaning or definition is clearly evident. So when I go back to read paragraph 14, "Oh yes, indeed," replied Pinkerton. "He jumped up and down so fast his teeth jiggled." And I go a little bit back, I see that it is his excitement. Pinkerton feels very, very excited because he's about to get this sandwich that he's been thinking of. And so when his teeth are jiggling, jumping up and down so fast, his teeth jiggle because he's feeling that excitement. And so in this situation, we see that it's an understanding question, but it's also asking, it's at that recall and reproduction level, the DOK1. Let's go on to the second part of the question, which asks, which detail from me first shows another example of the answer to part A? And so here there are different quotations. "Soon he heard the voice again, closer and louder." B, his imagination almost burst. C, he landed face to face with a small creature. D, Pinkerton waited 1 second, 2 seconds. And so here what is being asked is, again, this understanding. I have to go back into the text to show my understanding that he is excited. And so where is my evidence? And so that's taking us not to a DOK1, but it's taking us to a DOK2, the skills and concepts of being able to give an example. So what's an example of his excitement? And so it's going back into the text and being able to find that specifically in the story. And so the content that a student needs to know or to understand in here is really the content about character. Being able to read close enough so that they are able to pick up on the details that the author puts in the text that help to understand or make sense of how a character is thinking or how a character is feeling. And so we know Pinkerton is excited because his teeth are jiggling, and we also know he is excited because B, his imagination almost burst when he's just thinking of what is the sandwich that he's going to be getting, and he's going to get it first. Let's look at the next question in this, and here we see a picture or an image from the story, and the first question is, what is happening? And we're supposed to use this drop down menu to choose select one of the sentences that describes what is happening. And so here I can recall or remember what is happening. And remembering what is happening just means I'm being able to locate that in my memory of the story. And when I read this part of it, this was the part about Pinkerton was first on the bus and sat in the front row. And so that's giving me information from there. So when we look at Bloom's, we're looking at a remember, and we're looking at it at the webs of being able to recall that basic fact or detail that was pretty explicit in the text. Now we move to the second part of the question is, what does the picture add? And here it's not quite clear from the picture. I mean, it's not quite. It's something that the student has to understand. It's them being able to make that information, and so what they could be looking at here is being able to make that connection between how the other characters are feeling, and it again never explicitly stated in the story. And so here the picture shows not that Pinkerton is hungry or that the different things the scouts take to the beach, but really how the other scouts are upset at Pinkerton. And we can look a little bit more closely at their faces, and you can see their feelings. This one's been stepped on, this one is almost dropping things, and then this other pig is at the bottom, obviously been pushed aside by Pinkerton. And so here we're looking at the level 2 of skills and concepts is being able to make some basic inferences from the text about what is going on in this particular example. We're going to move on to the last question, which is a constructed response question. And here you have the combination of two texts together. Old Mother West Wind and the Sandwich. These are both characters. Both try to teach important lessons to characters in the stories. Write an essay that explains how Old Mother West Winds and the Sandwich's words and actions are important to the plots of the stories. Use what you learned about the characters to support your essay. And so in this particular example, you're really going, I'm thinking to myself, okay, what do I need to do? I kind of need to remember. I also need to understand, and I kind of need to analyze. I need to be able to determine how the words and actions of the West Wind and the Sandwich are important to the plots of the story. And so in this case, there really is this determination, breaking into parts, determining how parts relate to each other. And so in terms of brain, or in terms of what my brain has to do, I'm moving from just that simple remembering all the way to that analysis. And then I have to think about the content of what exactly am I going to be analyzing? What is my depth of understanding? And so in that sense, I really have to know how these two characters are important, the words and the actions are important to the plots of the story, most likely focusing on how they changed the characters in the story, how one of the characters was changed by the witch. And so in this case, there's the analysis in terms of the brain thinking, but in terms of Webb's depth of knowledge, you really are moving into the DOK3 and using strategic thinking and reasoning, using analyzing information, relationships between concepts and issues, being able to see how the characters or the plot changes. And so here we definitely have a much more complicated question, and just how it built up to that, and how there was these mixtures of maybe questions that were at the lower level, but this final prose constructed response really is asking for much more in terms of two things: the brain what the brain is supposed to do. So now it's analyzing. And then in terms of web, the depth of content, it's really analyzing to be able to pick apart the text and find the ways in which this character or the plot is affected by the words and actions. Something students probably would find extremely challenging. If we go back to the college and career readiness anchor standings for reading and think about the questions on the PARCC sample exam, and we can see just how many standards were addressed in those few questions. In terms of key ideas and details, standard 1 and 3. In terms of craft and structure, 4. Interpreting words and phrases. In terms of integration of knowledge and ideas, 7 and 9, and in range of reading and level of text complexity, 10, reading and comprehending complex literary text independently and proficiently. And so what you do see in the PARCC assessment is two things at play in terms of rigor. Rigor in terms of the thinking, the activity that the brain is going to be asked to do. And also pairing with that the content, the depth of understanding that a student would have to have in order to be successful with those questions. So we've come to the end of this webinar, and so thinking back to all of the information and the ideas that were shared, what's your definition of rigor now? And so take the time to write a definition, draw a picture if you would like, and discuss the changes in your response with your table partner. So think about how your definition might have changed based on the information that was shared in this webinar.